Okay, so it looks like attendees have kind of stabilized, so we can go ahead and get started. I do want to thank you all for being here for Feminist Futures of Peer Review. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach, the founder and CEO of Ideas on Fire, the academic editing and indexing agency helping interdisciplinary progressive scholars write and publish awesome texts, enliven public conversations like this one, and ultimately create more just worlds. So it's no secret that the standard peer review model is in some pretty deep crisis. Press acquisitions editors, conference planners, and journal editors are struggling to find enough peer reviewers to cover their massive backlogs. But at the same time, faculty reviewers are by and large pretty overwhelmed and exhausted by the deluge of new responsibilities that have been brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, state attacks on tenure and diversity, austerity politics, and commercial publishing models that tend to incentivize more and more research output at the expense of care and sustainability. And of course, this is compounded for those of us in various marginalized subject positions, because we're often fighting multiple of these fires on multiple fronts. Despite those challenges, though, and we'll get to some of the details of that today, folks in feminist and justice-oriented fields have developed what I think are some really inspiring alternative models for peer review and for knowledge production more broadly. And I wanted to organize today's event to center that in the peer review crisis discourse and to discuss how some of those practices might be adopted or adapted more broadly and in other contexts. So I'm honored to be joined here today with three fellow interdisciplinary scholars who are also fantastic IOF authors to explore how we are all navigating peer review right now in our different roles. So I'd like to introduce you all to April DJ Petillo, the co-editor of the groundbreaking journal, Feminist Anthropology, as well as an assistant professor of public sociology at Northern Arizona University. We also have Josen Masangkay Diaz, associate professor of ethnic studies at the University of San Diego, and author of the book Post-Colonial Configurations, Dictatorship, the Racial Cold War, and Filipino America. We also have Dolores Inés Casillas, professor of Chicana and Chicano Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and author of the book Sounds of Belonging, U.S. Spanish Language Radio and Public Advocacy. So the way this event is going to go is that the four of us will address some key questions and themes that we've identified and prepared ahead of time, and then there'll be time at the end for Q&A. So if you have a question that you want us to address in that Q&A session, go ahead and open the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen right there, and you can pop your question in there. Our fabulous Sarah Bernstein is going to be fielding those. She'll also be in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. So to kick off our conversation today, what are some ways that you have infused feminist politics and ethics into your approach to peer review as an author, an editor, a reviewer, or maybe all three of those things? April, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I think for me in this conversation, it's important to identify within feminism kind of the approach, generally speaking, that I embrace, which is absolutely an intersectional, anti-carceral perspective around getting to a place of multi-layered equity and for lack of a better word, liberation within our spaces. And part of what that has meant is that I really try to examine the systems at play. I'm a sociologist by training, so really thinking about social interactions with institutions, what that means, how it influences us, and how we influence that. So as someone who works as a co-editor, actively looking for peer reviewers, and often working with authors that I will admit I've had a bad reviewer to reaction at times. So I sometimes want to create space where especially emerging authors, emerging scholars have a better reviewer to experience than I've had sometimes in the past. So what that means is really being expansive in thinking about who we request at Feminist Anthropologies for peer review. We're often looking for people who aren't just sort of run-of-the-mill subject experts, but people who understand what's going on in a particular area, or some of the nuances and innovations within a field. Um, and we're also trying to encourage learning how to do peer review, because frequently when I did my first peer review, I spent a good week researching how to do it, because they don't, my graduate program didn't train me in how to do that. And the journal I was reviewing for at that time didn't actually have any guidelines. So, for instance, one of the things we do is we provide a list of very specific questions for the article to sort of guide that process. And a lot of that, that work as an editor comes from my experience both as an author and a reviewer, right? My first article was in what I call dissertation voice. And as a brown woman in the academy, you got to use the $25 words, as I call them sometimes, which means that a lot of people who you want to be reading your stuff they're not really going to read it because nobody has that bank account, so to speak. So, um, it's been a process, I think, of really trying to think through and focus on the intention and find ways of putting that into the process of thinking through review, particularly around scholarly articles. And I have to say, I think that's bled into all kinds of other areas for me. Now, when I write, I'm thinking about like what might I, as a reviewer, want to see if someone's approaching it from this perspective. And as a reviewer, I really try to ensure that I'm doing a lot of work to offer pathways and suggestions as opposed to a sort of supremacist, patriarchal, you must do it this way, this is the only way approach. And I think with that, I'm going to hush up and share.
I can also go ahead. I just wanted to latch onto a lot of things April said. I think really that when I did my first review, I treated it in some ways like graduate seminar, which is not the way that I do review now, right? Which is, well, this is what's wrong with it, and this is what's wrong with it, and I've learned a lot that it's just not helpful for me. It's not helpful for the people that I'm reviewing. So when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking a lot about engaging an ethic of generosity in my reviews, which is, I think the hard part for me is that it's sometimes seen as antithetical to rigor, but it doesn't have to be. That a lot of the most brilliant mentors I've had were some of the most generous people I've also been around as well. So, in a lot of ways, an ethic of generosity to me is, really meeting people at their arguments rather than beginning at a place of fault, which is, I think, where I started when I was doing review, which is sometimes how how graduate schools often. I remember a graduate advisor saying, is there anything good about this piece? And we're like, no, there really isn't, which is such a strange way, I think, to engage intellectual work. So yeah, really thinking about how to not impose my own academic investments onto others' work. So I can speak as a reviewer, right? If I'm often asking myself, what does the author want to do rather than what should they be doing? And then what are ways that I can actually help them accomplish this, right? So like I focus on those very specific ways, whether it's, evident or, all of these things that I think can feel more material. So, there's one example. There was a time I didn't necessarily agree with an author's reading a very specific text that I was really familiar with, but it was an essay that I really did feel was going to advance a conversation in really interesting ways regardless, right? So so my disagreement was really rooted in just the different ways that in terms of discipline that we were engaging with text, but I didn't see the actual essay as approaching as having anything kind of fundamentally wrong with it or politically suspect about the essay. And so at least just sort of like a mantra talking myself through, like, right, like what do authors want to do with this thing, and how again do we help them do that? So yeah, I'll pause there.
Those are all really great comments. I was thinking more of the fact that we're trained or socialized to have a thick skin when we accept feedback, and told that we're going to grow as scholars and be sharper scholars in how we listen, take, and incorporate that feedback. And I really want to encourage a model where we grow in how we give feedback. How we give feedback actually really defines us as scholars, and less so how we're going to take it. I think starting from there, I'm hoping that other people kind of replicate this sense of generosity, as you mentioned, as well. So that's one thing I think that I'm trying to get at. I think after all these years, get into that mindset, a very different kind of give take mindset. Because people have if you're not going to communicate something productive, then people are not going to act on it. And then it just doesn't move. It really is, goes counterintuitive to what peer feedback, peer review is supposed to be like.
I think that's a really interesting way to flip that very common narrative, right? And gets at some of that generosity point that you were making about the point isn't to tear apart this thing. There's nothing particularly peer about that, right? And I completely agree that a lot of graduate training encourages us to think that way, and we have to unlearn that as we come out of that. And this way of approaching review as a kind of political and ethical practice on the part of both us doing reviewing, and then also kind of how that reviewing circulates, and the social relationships that it either enables or can destroy, right, in the communities that we care about. I think that's a really different way of approaching review than I think a lot of us got training in. And it's encouraging to see us adopt that in different contexts. I'm curious how you all are navigating some of these challenges that I've been talking about. Obviously, April, you mentioned it's tough to find reviewers. For journals, it's tough to find reviewers for tenure packets. It's tough to find reviewers for books. It's tough to find reviewers. And of course, as reviewers, we're just freaking exhausted. And often because the peer review system is set up such that reviewers are the reviewed, right? The authors are also reviewers. So this is the same pool of people. I'm curious how you're all navigating this in the various roles that you inhabit, how you're kind of navigating some of these challenges.
So I'll jump in. I mean, I think as an editor, part of it, they always tell you lean on your networks, and I'm also a pretty social, chatty creature. So I do things to expand my network with absolutely upfront intention to expand the people I might be able to tap on the shoulder when I need a peer review. And part of that means, much like has already been said, like even building that network is a place of engaging a care ethic, a generosity ethic. And I often talk about it as a collaborative space, because I think for tenure review, for grant review, for academic publishing review, part of this is that we're coming from I like to think of it as a co-created community of inquiry. And that requires an approach that is all about collaborating. So, I just try to be upfront about those things. I think also and it's kind of scary, I guess, to say it in a public forum, but I do let people know as I meet them, like, I'm gonna be going up for tenure soon. Don't be surprised if you get tapped on the shoulder for that. And there's part of me that's like, all right, that's just my ethic and my approach. But I do often try to, for my less outgoing colleagues or for the people that I know who are doing very important but specific work, that you're not going to have as broad a community to pull from. Try to amplify their voices and their need, because I do believe in um, the feminist process of naming something um, up front, and then trying to collaboratively get community to engage within that process.
Yeah, so I think I can kind of speak to two things. I just want to also agree with April. I think as a less chatty person, I think it's a little harder. But I do think that when I'm thinking about, I will say that when I can't do a review, I also reach out individually to people who may be able to, rather than just sort of like having a cold call email, sit on their desk. So I try not to make recommendations, without people knowing that I'm making them. So there's that. As a reviewer, I think just like Cathy kind of pointed out, time is a big issue. There are essays that often come to me in Filipino and like Philam studies more broadly. Just they run the gamut. It's all kinds of things, and so I oftentimes struggle with what so many of us struggle with, which is time. And so some of the questions that come to mind are things like, do I say yes to this, even though this isn't necessarily my expertise? And if I don't say yes, would I be doing the author a kind of disservice? So those are, just in terms of, I'm not necessarily, maybe we can talk a little bit more about sort of resolutions to that, but those are some of the challenges that I face often, because I do get a lot in my inbox of just things that are maybe even remotely related to Philippine studies. As an author, I can also speak a little bit to, I often find myself thinking and writing with review parameters in my mind, which is hard for me, because those parameters look like, what are new questions that you're engaging? What are new contributions you have? What are new archives? And it's a challenge to kind of negotiate those specific things with actually how I approach my projects and what really feels good in the ways that I approach my projects, which has a lot less to do with concerns about things that are new and groundbreaking, and more to do with my interest in like revisiting old things, in new moments. So at least, in terms of just naming, as April kind of pointed out, naming the challenge for me as an author is really how to figure out that balance between kind of responding to what I know are review guidelines, and how I actually engage my work as an author, and wanting to be true to that, and true to the kinds of things that I bring me to the work itself.
I'm trying to be a little bit more pragmatic in how many requests I take. So I actually just finished one file, my routine kind of personnel file here, and saw that I did 15 for the last 18 months. And I don't want to do anything more than that. So I have this system where I will choose scholars who seem to be most vulnerable. Like if I'm going to dedicate time, if I'm going to throw my R1 institution behind this, and my full professor title behind this, and my time away from my family behind this, I'm going to do it to try and make a strong case for somebody who seems like they're in a little bit more of a vulnerable position. So that has been how I've chosen things. At one point, I was given a request from an editor, and the editor happened to be a colleague on campus to review a book, and I had said no. Then I saw them at a campus event, and they said, oh, I just saw that you said no. I thought you'd be interested. It's vaguely kind of in your field. And I said, I'm trying to prioritize women and faculty of color and queer scholars right now, because I'm trying not to do a lot. And it had never occurred to them at this journal how many book review requests they're actually sending out that are exclusively men, exclusively white men. So they completely revamped their policy after that random little coffee exchange we had before like a speaker. So I think kind of taking a cue from April, sometimes being really honest with people will have big impacts on how they choose and their own kind of journal guidelines as well. I also like to choose people's topics to review that seem very interdisciplinary and seem very ambitious. I feel that people like that take a risk. And so selfishly, like I like reading things like that. So that's like another way that I try to choose people, because I also think that they might have the hardest time identifying reviewers as well. And then one thing about boundaries that Josen had said, I think it is hard to kind of stay within the boundaries, right? When people give you parameters, I enjoy it because then it seems like it's an easier review. But I really love to take advantage of the option of private comments to the editor with both a book press or journal press. And I'm constantly on there. And that's where I emphasize things like, I know I said a lot of things about the introduction. Can you please encourage this author that most introductions actually have to be revised? So this is really common. Will you please try to emphasize that, as I did, that chapter 3 was amazing? So I think I try to have kind of a written communication with the editor in that private comments. And when I don't see that private comments, I actually have reached out to the press and said, is there any way I can write like a short follow-up to the editor about this? And they've always been very gracious about doing that.
I just want to jump in too to say thank you to both of you as someone who's actively looking for reviewers. The times, you know, there have been plenty of times where reviewers have had to say no or were not interested. And our ethic has always been people know their schedules and their realities, and we honor that and appreciate that honesty. I think in addition, it's always wonderful when there's like a recommendation for someone to go to, and using the private comments box so that, or the editorial comments box, so that we can use that to sort of help guide and amplify this particular manuscript or this particular piece. That has been literally when we have our weekly meeting, as editors, we're jumping up and down, even though we may have had 5 people say, I can't possibly do this right now. There's a collection of people who will offer up someone else to go to. So, and I think of that as part of building the scholarly community, right? To bring new people into the reviewer fold.
I really like the kind of twist on that, though, Josen, that you were pointing out, of asking them first, or at least checking in with them, right? Just so they're not getting a cold email from a journal editor that said, hey, you've been recommended as the best person for this thing. You're like, who are you? And no, I don't have time for that either. So that kind of ethic of, hey, person I know who I think would be good for this, like, what's going on in your life? Is this something that you'd be okay being recommended for? I think that's a really nice kind of addition to that practice.
And sometimes they do say Josen recommended you, and it's like, oh gosh, okay, so so just being able to lay that out is important. Yeah.
I'd be curious to hear how you've experienced changes in the peer review structure. I mean, beyond just, obviously challenges, we talked about some of those, but this is scholarly publishing more broadly, certainly higher education more broadly, and peer review more specifically has undergone some pretty enormous changes in the past 3 to 5 years, even pre-COVID. And obviously we're still dealing with kind of the fallout of some of those changes. So maybe in addition to some of these challenges, or separately from them, what are some of those big changes in peer review that you've seen in your various roles in the process?
All right, I can start. I don't know if I throw it out there. So I think just like you said, Kathy, some of the challenges in peer review are more broadly related to the structures of labor at the university. There are fewer jobs, more contingency, fewer people willing to take on work with fewer perceived benefits, right? So in the last 3 to 5 years, these conditions have only intensified. But and I think maybe all of you have pointed this out in one way or another, but I also think that the pandemic, right, has shifted the ways that a lot of people not just do work, but think about work. And it's important to take that into account when reviewing. As all of us know, the pandemic didn't create inequity, right? But it aggravated it. Brought into clear focus in a lot of places. So just as an example, I had to review a reappointment file, and the colleague was really clear. As you know, the rank and tenure committee did say to kind of put this in their file, but was really clear about the ways that the pandemic shifted productivity for them, and it was really important for me and others to take that into account, to evaluate accordingly. But this was like a challenge, right? Because I think there's sometimes a way to think about, like, it's not to think about their work as less than what they might have otherwise done if we weren't in a global pandemic, but really to ask how their work is actually helping us rethink our relationships to work, to the university, and really kind of to each other during the global pandemic. So I think more than actually just being like, well, this is a lesser version of what they would have done, and we should be kind about this, is actually how they were engaging in, how I was reading it was what are they actually helping us revisit? What are they actually helping us rethink? And yeah, how is that file doing that for us, rather than it being a kind of like lack or absence?
Well, I think that peer review has changed a lot. I think my clearest sign that there was some kind of serious shortage and crisis is when I received the same manuscript from 3 different presses and was shocked by that. And had to tell like the second press, I had to tell the third press, like, I've already reviewed this. And they had different ethics behind that as well, I should say. The second press actually didn't mind and was still interested in the feedback. The third press was like, absolutely not. That's very unethical. And I'm happy to give you your $100 book credit anyway, or something like that. But that's when I thought, wow, what a shortage that I've been asked within the span of 6 weeks by 3 different presses. But I think years ago, people wouldn't have sent it to 3 different presses, right? So there's a climate where we're unsure about one press. And so we feel, which is also this institutional crunch. So now it's okay to send it out to several presses at the same time. Whereas I think years ago, you developed the relationship, there was a little bit more time in the acquisition type of relationship before things were formally submitted. And I think that sense of relationship has just become much more difficult to manage. So that was a clear sign, I thought, that things had changed. And then that we don't get full manuscripts. And I think this is something I've kind of enjoyed. I've kind of enjoyed from book presses getting a book proposal and a couple of chapters, or book proposal and 3 chapters. There's something about feeling that you're giving feedback at a time when it is still growing, rather than critiquing. It feels more of a critique when it's already said and done, rather than I'm being your peer and this is just my 2 cents as you keep building and growing this argument.
I think too, it's the 3 to 5 years. So this is maybe about 6 years ago. I remember it was before I had a number of things as an author, as a scholar out in the world, and my supervisor at that time was sort of doing you must get things out there, you must get things out there. And then in a side comment to someone else that same day, I heard her say, I never do peer review. I refuse to do peer review. I don't have time for that. And when I think about some of the changes in peer review, I'm now hearing more people who are more senior scholars who are actually expressing an interest in doing peer review. And for all the reasons you two have already listed, like finding people to actually do that is sometimes a challenge. It's also this real crunch place because as someone who has been on search committees, like reading some of the applications from people who are coming out of graduate school with the book proposal, right? And knowing that some of my more senior colleagues are like, I didn't publish a book until I was going up for tenure, not applying. So there's this, I think many of us are sort of caught in the middle in between these expectations. And I think it comes from a sense of desperation almost of you have to go above and beyond and keep going above and beyond to just be recognized as a valuable resource and scholar that a university or a publisher or a journal should invest in, like invest in your potential, which also puts the crunch on. There have to be ways to encourage, support more people engaging in that sort of what I see as a mentorship role through peer review. So is it a change or a challenge? I'm not 100% sure, but I do think there's this shifting that happens, a push and pull between what the, for lack of a better way to put it, the sector that we're in wants, but what is wanted is not always feasible and possible. And I'm hoping that what I'm seeing is a sort of sea change to recognizing that, be it, I don't know, in annual reviews, giving some kind of credit for engaging in peer review, right? Making it worth people's while additionally to do that. But also a kind of, as been said before, generosity and care around engaging in the process, and a purposeful, intentional push towards trying to amplify the voices of those who are often erased or marginalized. So I'm hopeful. It's not here yet, but I'm hopeful.
And I mean, I think it's a good example about how this is an ongoing practice. This is an ongoing kind of set of forms of labor. It's not, I hope no one arrived here today hoping there'd be a single answer and you can copy it down and go home and fix it. I would love for that to be the case, but that's not usually how structural problems tend to get solved. And I would certainly argue that this is very much a structural problem. But given that, I'm curious to hear specific recommendations that you have. We've talked about some of them, but if you have additional ones for how, in a dream world, if you got to run everything, what recommendations would you have for how academic publishing more broadly, maybe higher education more broadly, can build a more sustainable peer review system?
I just want to amplify something that was said before, in terms of really moving from peer review as critique to engaging in a collaborative way, and thinking from a generous space. The issues that are going on with peer review are also a part of just the academy, right? And I think the change here also needs to happen with a change in how we think about the role of the academy, and ways that we might pull away from having to be the first. Like innovation isn't always the first time someone has thought of it. Sometimes innovation happens when, like Josen has said, you go back and look at what has gone on before, but from a different perspective, from the here and now, or the slightly more recently than original. And I would recommend that we sort of encourage that, right? We engage that process of sort of thinking about how are we defining innovation? How does that set up practices that are based in a supremacist logic? And how might we then actively, as part of our practice, counter that in the feedback we give, whether it be to reject an opportunity to review or embrace it. There are ways that we can do that that are more about a collaborative sense of care.
There's a small journal that I really have always admired and they outwardly call themselves like a very feminist editorial process. And it's a small journal. It's called MALCS. It stands for Mujeres Activas en Letras y Cambio Social. So women active in academic and social change. And they host an institute every July. And it's about 3 to 4 days, and people submit a draft beforehand, and they actively rewrite, present, share each other's ideas, are with the editors there. So they have kind of this intense experience, and then it sets themselves up to submit it to the journal. And that just seems like such a great collaborative process of growth, for sure. So I've always have really admired that process as well. I also think thinking of peer review as just feedback. I've been thinking about this in terms of like, how are we socialized to give feedback? And I think it's just when your friend wants you to double check if this text sounds mean or if it doesn't sound mean, right? I think it kind of thinking of it in terms of these building blocks. And I was thinking about that yesterday. My son emailed the high school teacher, he's a freshman, to basically contest a grade. And the way of trying to frame that, right? Like, be respectful. Is there any chance? If not, I understand. Thank you. Like all those types of framings, right? It just reminded me that, wow, he's 14, but I'm teaching him right now how to communicate with somebody who has a lot of power, right? She might dismiss your email or she might not. And thinking about, I hope that we always collaborate on these emails, right? Until one day he doesn't need my collaboration anymore, he can kind of advocate for himself in that sense. But I think feedback, we need to think of it as how it begins there. When a friend double checks your text or double checks an email. And that's kind of like the building blocks, right? We're always careful about that tenor and that, not cadence, but that tenor and how you're communicating it. And maybe trying to carry that same sense of ethics, right, when we give feedback.
I just want to co-sign on what April. Yeah, it's very funny that it just like I want to emphasize like that the work that takes is like such meaningful and important work. The best reviews I've gotten as an author have felt like conversations rather than as like feedback, right? But and then also just like conversations between someone who also is like really invested in the things that I'm talking about, and that has meant so much, and it makes, I don't know if I'm being a little bit naive, but it makes it better. I think, you know, it feels like I'm part of something bigger than just the article. So there's that. I think this has already been said, but having reviews become part of maybe like research requirements that, you know, because when I first I'm still learning how to review, but they feel like reading practices. They feel like really important reading practices to be able to, because I've also gotten great reviews. And I'm like, I can't believe that you see that in the work as well. And that's, it really is a kind of important intellectual practice and community practice that feels like it's not evaluated as heavily in, you know, rank and tenure files, right? I think April mentioned this already, but one of the best review parameters that I got was when I was reviewing was I had questions that felt so generative when I was reviewing, like look for these kinds of questions, and then they, the journal had shared that with the reviewers, and I was like, this is actually really helpful for those of us who are a little bit newer to review, for example. So and those kinds of questions help to shift how people are thinking about review, as Inés was pointing out, as feedback rather than actually as scathing critique, which I've also gotten as well. So maybe some of those questions I kind of put down here, like encouraging collective thinking rather than individualized brilliance, right? So like paying attention to citational practices and things like that. How authors, and as I'd already pointed this out, right, how authors push like well-worn boundaries, like which is like recognizing interdisciplinarity rather than policing disciplinary boundaries. I've certainly gotten reviews that are like, why aren't you a historian? It's like, oh, because I'm just not. Right? So those kinds of reviews are hard. And then asking reviewers whether a project, right, like encourages dialogue, which is thinking about its future with people, right? And because I think sometimes maybe in terms of review, it might not be there yet, but the potential is so there, and I think that's like such an incredible thing to be able to recognize that, and then to imagine its circulation and its life outside, which is cool. So, yeah.
I would love to see reviewing count, quote unquote count, more in hiring and promotion. I think this is part of a broader conversation about how service is valued or not valued, as the case is usually on campuses. And I mean, I think that's important, both just in terms of this is something that people spend a lot of time on, and it deserves to be recognized in the same way that research and teaching does. But it's also because that labor maps onto bodies in really specific ways. So the folks that end up doing way more service, including reviewing, tend to be more marginalized. And when that is the standard, when those kinds of practices are not valued, by an institution and by an industry more broadly, I would say, that shapes which types of people and which types of bodies and which types of communities and which types of worldviews get to count as scholarship and get to count as professors and get to count as leaders, right? And so I think this is part of a broader shift that needs to happen in terms of academic labor, in terms of scholarly labor, and valuing all of that. So I would certainly like to see all of these kinds of things implemented as well. So I think, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I feel like I try to do that in personnel reviews. Really, it's fascinating what they'll send you as a file in terms of we're telling you what to look at in the scholar, and often the service, the reviewing, any editorial type of work, that's all not highlighted, right, in their formal assessment. And I try to dedicate a paragraph to look at what this person has contributed to building the field. Look what they've done at your university in all these different capacities. And I was really encouraged by another professor to do that. Like, we should be highlighting that in formal letters. And she even goes an extra step and writes, you are fortunate to have this person, right? Because they've done X, Y, and Z. So that was a really good conversation I had with her as a clue as to, I don't have to just review what they send me, right? If I know something else about that person or look at the last few pages, to really kind of take advantage of that letter to kind of highlight that. Sorry, Cathy.
I just want to quickly add, I think that is really powerful, and thank you and the person that you were talking to for doing that. And I also want to encourage people as they write their own reviews, as they do the self-eval, to own that. I engage in review. This is how many hours of work that is. And this is my contribution to the field and to the academy, because, scholars are not just built in the classroom. They're built in these feedback loops. And without that, we will not have as many.
One of the questions that's has been submitted, which I think is something that I was hoping we get to talk about, is this question of anonymized reviews and different models for anonymization. So obviously we have double anonymous double, I cannot talk today. Good that I'm leading a webinar. Double anonymous reviews, where neither the reviewer nor the author knows who's on the other side. The journal editor or managing editor, depending on how that label is distributed, they might know. You have single anonymous reviews where one side knows the other person, but not vice versa. And then you have fully open reviews, right, where everyone knows everybody who's involved in the whole thing. I'm curious what you all think about that kind of multiple forms of anonymization, and if you have thoughts on how you want to approach that.
So I'll go first. We use a double blind process, and I think part of how I feel like it has worked well for us. I feel like part of the reason why is because we have feminist in our title. So one, there is larger conversation among the community that recognizes itself as feminist or an offshoot of feminist ideals around a particular attention to both rigorous but also collaborative work. Not everybody, but most people. One of the things that we do too is because personally, this is not the journal, but just personally, I do believe sometimes it's easy to hide behind an anonymous response, right? And you can just get all your frustration out on this person who had nothing to do with that frustration. So part of how we sort of encourage accountability is we keep it anonymized, but once a manuscript has gone through review, if it has been accepted, we share that feedback with all the reviewers, but we also give some highlights of what those reviews look like, so people can have a sense as a reviewer of where they fall within the spectrum. We don't share names in that process, but there have been times when reviewers have come back and said, oh, I think I was really harsh. Maybe I didn't need to be harsh in that way. And this isn't meant as a, slap on the wrist, but it's an opportunity to reflect on what you've put out there in terms of building community, and a particular level of accountability within that. So in my mind, like, I would prefer if people knew. I think in some ways it can keep people honest. I recognize it can create other issues and imbalances of power that are problematic. But I don't think any of the processes are without problems.
I would agree with that. I think when I think I'm reminded of a meeting I had that was a kind of, for lack of a better word, like a norming process, where there was one reviewer who realized that he was unfairly harsh, like more so than I think anyone else had. And unfortunately, it didn't get him to sort of change right that, but it allowed us to actually have a conversation about the kinds of reviews that were actually going on. So I think that was incredibly helpful. I'm also someone who believes in a less anonymity on that, and like April pointed out, I think there are very distinct problems associated with it, but I see them sometimes as book reviews, right? Like seeing that what people thought and how people kind of imagine the word. Like that has been, it's been helpful to me. And in the best case scenarios, they do become part of that broader conversation that I was talking about. Sometimes they're not, but they do help, I think, a kind of collective like world building around a work.
Yeah, I try to give reviews assuming that they're going to know who it is. That's just the assumption. And one of the first reviews I did my second or third year as a professor for a major journal, I loved the topic. I thought, oh my goodness, why didn't I think of this topic? This is so good. I loved reading it, but it was apparent that it was co-authored, and I got the sense that maybe it was a graduate student and a professor who had done it. And I got the sense, and I had actually written, I had written this. I said, to be honest, I'm guessing that this is a collaboration between the professor and a graduate student, and it might be more helpful if there's a little bit more of a tightening of the argument, kind of saying it looks like the graduate student did a lot of the work, kind of, right? When there should be a little bit more mentorship to make it a little tighter. I then got an email from the main journal editor saying, we're going to move forward with this. It was a revise and resubmit. They resubmitted it. It was a beautifully polished. I teach it still to this day. The main editor said the authors would like to know your name before it goes to print. And I was so nervous because they told me then their name, and they're like a very senior person in my field. And I said I didn't feel comfortable. I felt like such a vulnerable kind of position. And then they circled back 2 months later. They're asking again for your name. And then the editor said, they just want to thank you by name in the article. And I didn't know that. I thought they were I'm going to have to put them on my do not ever review list, that list. I was like, now I'm growing that list already. I've only been in this gig for 2 years. I was just so nervous about that. So I think ever since then, I decided like I should just write as if everyone's going to know who you are, right? Because that was such undue stress for 6 months of that. So that's that.
To this point, I like to write reviews knowing even if it does remain anonymous, that if somebody does find out, I can stick by it, right? That there's nothing that I have to hide behind, that there is always that kind of act of generosity there, that I would hope that people who do find out, like that wouldn't be a problem. So I'm realizing I didn't realize that until you actually named it, is that is something that I try to do, is always write with the idea that people would find out, and I can stick by the review.
And I've been that person that thankfully had reviewers who saw the argument I was seeing, but they also sort of pointed me in a direction that was chef's kiss to making that work, and thanked them, in the first footnote, because it was a stroke of brilliance. I was so focused on my path that didn't occur. And those are wonderful moments that, if we are strict in the anonymized process, those thank yous are important. So
one of the other questions that folks have submitted is this question of payment. And I know this is a hotly debated topic. Should reviewers be paid? And if so, how much and in what way? What do you all think?
I gotta tell you, I would love to pay reviewers. I don't know of many academic journals that are in the position to give much in terms of an honorarium right now, but I know of several that would love to be able to pay reviewers. I've also heard about the option to offer letters of thank you to reviewers that they can put in their file if they're working within the academy. Some places have a page of thank yous that's published once a year to everyone who's done a review. Those are awesome options. But that's for a journal. when I think about for things like grant reviewers or personnel file reviewers, like that can get a little more complicated. That said, I stand behind, like, there are ways that it would be really nice to just sort of acknowledge publicly, like, this was a hard thing to put together, or this was a tough year for me personally. And as a reviewer, you saw that. You saw not just what I did, but my potential and the circumstances, and um and read through all of that with grace. So that's, I think of it as not just a skill, but also a calling. So I would love to have a way to thank all the reviewers. I just don't know the way that works for everyone.
Yeah, I agree with the, I mean, I think that would be wonderful. I know that some, journals will and presses will offer compensation in different ways, even if it's not, paid in dollar amounts. So I think that is something that I've always thought about, and I'm sure will certainly attract more reviewers. I wonder too about the smaller journals. I just wonder about the capacity for certain journals and for presses to be able to do that, and whether it would intensify or aggravate already existing kinds of inequities. But it I don't think that throwing it out the window as like no compensation is something that I'm that I've thought of as the solution, right? I do think compensation is something that would get around a lot of issues. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure the details of what that would look like.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that either as well. I'm also more the past 2 or 3 reviews not positioning my reviewing work as service, and I'm actually positioning it as diversity. So because of the decisions I'm making, I always make the argument that my job as a reviewer, because of the scholarship I choose and the scholars I choose, this is the work I'm doing to change the academy. It's not service. So I'm trying to frame it in that way as well. Just because I think service has also been framed that has different connotations, right? So in that sense, I think it kind of changes a little bit about how I position it. And I'm hoping that larger kind of personnel review committees at the university also, the feedback that I've gotten is that they do understand what I'm saying. And I feel that they take that into stronger consideration for me as a scholar than they would if it was just service. So that's my mantra. If you'd leave with anything, I would try to pitch it and frame it as something bigger than service. Because I really do think there's so many things that you have to write. And then Cathy talks about this, you edit. You do all of that to try to change the way people think about the world, right? And I think that looking at our role as peer editors and peer reviewers is part of that.
I think that is a fantastic place to end, which is very convenient because we are coming right up on time here. So I just want to thank you all for being here and joining us in this discussion. A big thanks to Sarah as well for being technical support, and to our amazing speakers for sharing all of these fantastic ways that they are creating different models for peer review. So I just want to let everybody know to be on the lookout for an email from me at Ideas on Fire with a link to the recording and the transcript. There'll be full captions. I know there were some technical problems with the captions in the beginning of this. That will be fixed in the video. And there'll also be some resources to help you navigate peer review and hopefully build some more sustainable futures for scholarly publishing. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for making this space.